The war on ivermectin. You've now written a book about this, and there certainly has been over the last several years of this pandemic. I can't believe it's been over 3 years now. But there certainly was an absolute war on ivermectin. So I want to start with where we're at right now with the drug. Last
Sure.
I had heard, the FDA had changed its tune a little bit, right? And they came out saying that they were going to be looking into ivermectin. They were going to be looking further into it. And I feel like that was a few months ago. Is that where we're at from the establishment, narrative on ivermectin today?
You know, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. I think you're referring to, well, it's actually a case that my partner brought with a couple other doctors against the FDA. They tried to sue the FDA for really interfering with the practice of medicine, which is outside their scope. And in that court case, the FDA was backtracking. They were saying, "Oh, we never said not to use it." They're trying to pretend that they weren't making recommendations against it. And there's plenty of evidence to see that they were interfering and they were trying to influence doctors and scare doctors into using it. And so there was some press around that story, but they certainly haven't backtracked on the fact that they haven't approved it. They'll never approve it for COVID because uh, they it's already approved. We don't need it approved for COVID, right? It's
Right.
off-label use. Let me answer that differently, Kim. Where we are with ivermectin is that, you know, the book is really, it's kind of autobiographical because myself and my organization, we were involved in a lot of aspects of COVID, but kind of the center and the core of the book is I really go into what happened, this war on ivermectin. And one of the main chapters is the chapter that I call the Big Six, because out of the 97 controlled trials from all over the world, the summary analysis of which show just incredibly large magnitude benefits from ivermectin, the world focused on six trials, and which were purportedly the high quality, large, rigorous trials. And those trials were unique. And I will tell you, to your question, like where's the FDA? I would bring in the NIH as well as far as the establishment. They literally ignored, dismissed all of the other 91 trials, focused on six. They are not going to recommend it because those big six trials were the only trials conducted by investigators completely drowning in pharmaceutical company conflicts. That's number one.
Hmm.
Number two, the shenanigans that they pulled in those trials, and I outlined it in that chapter, were so reproducible, brazen. I mean, this is one of the main weapons of the pharmaceutical industry is designing trials with predetermined results. It's well described in the disinformation playbook, which is also what the book is kind of structured around, which is an article written by the Union for Concerned Scientists back in 2017, where they outline tactics that industries deploy when science emerges that's inconvenient to their interests. And publishing stuff in high impact journals is how they do it. So I'll just finish with that question, Kim, is that they're gonna stand on those trials showing that ivermectin is ineffective. And that's what those trials concluded. But they had to do really tons of manipulations. And that was really shocking to me that they were published in such high impact journals with brazen manipulations to bury the evidence of efficacy.
So let's talk now about so we're basically, what you're saying is we haven't made any progress with the established narrative on ivermectin necessarily. So
I
they're
say,
not.
yeah, I would say differently. I think we fought the war to a stalemate. I don't
Okay.
anticipate any. I think that this is my assessment of where we are with ivermectin is that all of the doctors around the world in every country who have used it know that it works, will continue to use it. The entire rest of particularly advanced health economies of the world, and the establishment, as you say, the system, I call them system doctors, um,
Hmm.
it's been roundly concluded that it doesn't work. They are not going to start using it, and they can't. Retail pharmacies won't fill. Hospital formularies have removed it from their formulary. So, I mean, the war was really vicious. I mean, I've never seen an attack on a medicine. I mean, we don't even have that kind of attack on fentanyl. I mean, they went after ivermectin as if it was fentanyl. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. And so, one of the world's safest medicines, literally one of the world's safest. I mean, they give it out to millions of people across continents for parasitic diseases. You know, it's literally distributed because it's so safe. And so, anyway, that's why Kim, I would say that we're at a stalemate. I don't anticipate unless the fraud in these trials is exposed through court action, which I'm a little bit aware of, I don't know that it's going to shift much right now.
So tell us why it works. Like, what is it about this particular drug? I mean, I heard it first really early on in the pandemic. I heard of ivermectin, and I actually had ordered a bunch and put it on. I stockpiled it early on before anyone was really talking about it because I'd read a study, and at this point, COVID was really early. We didn't know anything. And there was a study that had come out of Australia saying that they had done some tests with some cells, some COVID cells, and they found that ivermectin did have some sort of, it seemed to have some effect on COVID in a like petri dish, essentially. Right. And I thought, okay, well, that's promising. So I went and found an Indian pharmacy and ordered a bunch of it and just had it on hand thinking, well, if it turns out that this thing is the thing that works, I definitely I want to keep my family safe. And so that was really, really, really early on. And then it started being talked about more. But what is it about this drug in particular? Kind of explain to us the drug and the mechanism of why it would work on COVID.
Yes. So great question. So it has about 20 different mechanisms of action that have been sort of elucidated and identified. But the mechanism, so basically it interrupts the replication of certain critical enzymes that the virus needs to replicate. So it literally is an antiviral. It stops replication. And that's what that Australian study showed. Another really interesting feature of it is they did a lot of what's called molecular docking studies where they look at the molecular conformations. And it's one of the most tightly binding medicines to the spike protein. So if it can bind to spike, it can't enter. And it can kind of neutralize the virus. So it actually stops replication and it binds it. That's why it's really good as a preventative. That's the other, like, there's so many frauds around ivermectin, but the prevention trials, which you never hear talked about, there's 17 of them, 4 of them are randomized. All of them show wickedly reduced rates of COVID if you take it regularly, but no one talks about that anymore. But here's the other cool thing about that, Kim. When I first, when we started to see some of these reports of ivermectin working, I wrote the first definitive, like, comprehensive review paper. And when I was doing research for that paper, I was stunned to find out that there is studies, all of them in vitro, like you mentioned, since 2012, of like a dozen RNA viruses, like Zika, dengue, West Nile, HIV, influenza. And in fact, Robert Malone, I'm sure everyone knows who Robert is. He did a lot of work for years on identifying, using high throughput sequences, candidates, repurposed drug candidates for various infectious diseases. And he worked a lot on Ebola. And ivermectin was the number one candidate for Ebola that he had identified at that time. And so it has a long history of working as an antiviral, and it showed itself again in COVID, which shouldn't have been a surprise.
So ivermectin, though, is the approved use, and why it won the Nobel Prize was because it's for parasites, right? It's for right. Okay. Right.
It's exactly, that mechanism is different, the way it works in parasites than with viruses. But yeah, it's a proven anti-parasite and it's used widely for that. Yes.
The person who developed ivermectin, when they made this drug, when they were they were in the lab and they're trying to find something, what was their purpose? Were they looking for an anti-parasitic? Is that what they were trying to make?
So that's the coolest story. So it wasn't actually there was some development in the lab, but it's actually a natural substance. So Satoshi Omura, who was a professor from Japan, he was a microbiologist, and his specialty was identifying compounds made by microorganisms to fend off or fight other organisms. And so he was at a golf course. This is back in the 70s. He was at a golf course in Japan. He was digging around trying to collect soil samples, and he found this species of bacteria called Streptomyces, which they ended up calling it Streptomyces ivermectin. And when he brought it to the lab, they noticed that when there was parasites nearby, they all died. And so there was something this bacterium was making that was killing nearby parasites. It was highly effective. So they isolated, it was called ivermectin, and then they did some modifications to it in the lab, like you said. And that was he partnered with Merck, with a scientist at Merck named William Campbell. And they developed ivermectin, and they found, like, the most remarkable, it's called the wonder drug for a reason, and they won the Nobel Prize for this work. because really never before in history had they seen something so potent, like as an anti-parasite. It actually also has antibacterial and viral properties, um, but that was so safe. It was so well tolerated, and it's used widely to treat humans, animals, for a number of parasitic diseases. But the safety was unparalleled, and so it was truly a remarkable discovery because, after they identified that it was effective against parasites, the WHO, when the WHO was still doing public health, they created these programs, distribution programs across Africa and Asia, and they literally eradicated two of the most debilitating diseases that we had as a globe. It was river blindness, where in endemic areas, most of the communities, the adults were blind by the age of 40. Children would lead them around with sticks because they couldn't see. And then there's another one more commonly known as elephantiasis, where you have those huge swollen
Yeah.
legs. And so really disfiguring and debilitating diseases that were essentially eradicated. They gave away billions of doses. And the real interesting story about it is at that time, Merck decided to donate the drug for free to the WHO. And some of the cynical things I've heard about that is that they realized they couldn't make money because in all the endemic areas where these were pervasive, they really wouldn't be able to sell it for a profit. And that's part of the story, but they did donate it to the world, and the discoverers won the Nobel Prize. But it was only like in 2012 when its antiviral properties started to be identified.
So they started to test it for other things. They thought, okay, we know this works as an antiparasitic. And so you're saying that this was a bacteria that was creating this sort of this. So this kind of reminds me, ironically, there's this mosquito program. Have you heard about this the World Mosquito Program that Bill Gates actually funds?
Yeah, that's scary.
Right. And they actually inject when they say we're not modifying these mosquitoes. What we're doing is we're injecting a bacteria into them. And the bacteria then kills like all of these diseases, the possibility for them to then spread these diseases because the bacteria is doing the dirty work. So it's like, I guess, kind of similar to what what you're saying, how they discovered ivermectin was that this bacteria was doing the dirty work and killing off all of these other parasites.
That is
which
quite
kind of
similar.
Interesting.
But you think of ivermectin almost like penicillin, right? It's the same thing, right? Penicillin was secreted and made from fungi, mold. And so this was made from here's another really cool part of that story is that species of streptomyces that he found, to date, it's the only place in the world it has ever been located. So you had this Japanese microbiologist who's digging around the soil in Japan, and he finds this bacteria. It couldn't have happened anywhere else. Had he been, Honduran or American or anything, he would have never found this substance. So I just find that a really kind of just like serendipitous, almost like a miraculous discovery.
So they start testing this, you say, in 2012 for other things, because my big question is, well, what made the Australians want to test it for COVID? Where do you get this leap here where it goes from here's an antiparasitic curing river blindness and elephantitis, and suddenly they're like, well, let's see what it does with COVID. I mean, there's a million drugs out there. You think you would, what made them say ivermectin? Let's try this one.
Because if they know anything about virology, they would know that there's a body of evidence from 2012 showing that it was really effective at stopping RNA viruses, right? Which is what SARS-CoV-2 was. And so they said, hey, we found this, ivermectin seems to be working in cultures, vitro studies for all of these other viruses that are similar.
Yeah.
So they tried it, and it was a really profound result. I mean, they said that like SARS-CoV-2 disappeared from the cell culture model within 48 hours. And so
right. So so they must have known about this research. They must have.
Yeah.
For them to pick ivermectin out of all the drugs out there to be testing against COVID, they must have known that it had a history of this benefit.
Of course they did. And like I said, Robert Malone had already in some of his work identified ivermectin against Ebola, which is another virus. And so it's known as a really good drug candidate for viruses. And so and this is where the corruption starts, is that Satoshi Omura wrote to Merck. I mean, he literally won a Nobel Prize with a Merck scientist, some years ago. He wrote to Merck asking for funds to do clinical trials of ivermectin and COVID. What did Merck say? No.
Wow.
No.
So he wanted to try it with COVID. So even the creator of ivermectin wanted to try it.
winner.
right, wanted to
Yeah.
try it with COVID, and they said no.
They said they didn't want to give them funds.
What do you
So
think the motivation, before we get into how ivermectin works against COVID and whether it still does, what was this war on ivermectin that then took place? What do you think really motivated that? Because they really went hard after ivermectin. Well, first hydroxychloroquine and then ivermectin. And they were saying how, you're not a horse. Don't take ivermectin, calling it horse medicine, claiming that people like Joe Rogan were taking horse medication. He was taking the human version of ivermectin, but they still smeared him on CNN. What is it? Why do you think they just went so hard after like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin?
yeah. So the book, right, is called The War on Ivermectin, but really what it is, it's a case study of what happens when science emerges that's inconvenient to industry interests. So this drug, ivermectin, is, although it's a case study on ivermectin, these disinformation campaigns and wars on repurposed drugs have been going on for decades. This is not new. This is really almost not even about ivermectin. It's really about what the pharmaceutical industry does against inconvenient science. And so I've said, I wrote the book, The War on Ivermectin. One of my colleagues could easily write the book, War on Hydroxychloroquine, and they could just copy my work. Because literally almost everything that they did to ivermectin, they had done to hydroxychloroquine with a couple of differences. But they've been doing this for decades. I mean, repurposed or off-patent drugs are the Achilles heel of the business model of the pharmaceutical industry. And the reason why I think ivermectin was so unique is I don't think ever a single drug threatened as large a marketplace, right? So you're talking about tens, if not many tens, if not north of $100 billion if you combine vaccines and Paxlovid and Molnupiravir and Remdesivir, right, which we've spent billions on. So this had it would have decimated the markets for all of that. And then, where it starts to get uncomfortable, right, when you go back to the simulation exercises, right, for the next pandemic in 2019, what was their main focus was vaccine hesitancy. They considered the management of the next pandemic was they had to combat vaccine hesitancy. And I will tell you, beyond the financial profits, they knew if there was a safe, cheap, widely available drug, who's going to line up for the experimental shot that no one knows if it's safe or it works, right? And so
Right.
they had to destroy it. And they pulled out stuff that they've never done before. I mean, like this part about frightening the pharmacies into filling. Where were they during the opioid epidemic?
Right.
Right? I mean, uh, it's but yes, that's why they destroyed it. It was a massive, massive threat. And the first, although, right, like I said, there was a war on ivermectin, and it was a deadly war. I mean, millions have died as a result of all of the tactics they deployed using media, social media, medical journals, agencies, and capturing these trialists who did these trials. I mean, those trialists had one job: come back with data and a paper showing it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And that's so clear from what they did. It's so clear that's why they do it. They had to destroy the evidence of efficacy of ivermectin.
So they've been doing this forever. It's just that it became so public because COVID was obviously on the top of everyone's mind, was the main focus of all of our lives for so long. And so everything about COVID made the news, made headline news, was talked about endlessly on the mainstream media. And so you're saying that this sort of assault on medications being repurposed had been going on for a long time. We're just, as the public, aware of it now because it was front and center in our lives with the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, and you could see, they pulled out. They're expert at this, right? So disinformation, as defined in the disinformation playbook, which is the industry tactics, that was pioneered and really developed by the tobacco industry, who successfully deployed those tactics again at the level of medical journals, right? Every time a study came out showing that it caused esophageal cancer and lung cancer, what would they do? They would publish a study that conflicted with that, right? So it's all they're trying to do is inject doubt and create uncertainty to protect their product. So they've been doing stuff like this. Tobacco did it for 50 years. Pharma has been doing it for decades around safe patented, off-patent drugs. And so it's not new. And you saw them go after hydroxychloroquine early. And the stuff that they had to do to hydroxychloroquine was crazy. Like, I'll just tell you a little anecdote. Like, for me, I still can remember the first time in COVID when I really started to question what these agencies were doing. And my initial conclusion as to what they were doing is they were being stupid and ignorant, right? The experts in the agencies I literally thought they were being ignorant. I didn't think they were being corrupt, but the day that I heard, I was driving my car. It was like March of 2020, and I heard an announcement that the FDA had restricted the use of hydroxychloroquine to the hospital. And I'm in my car and I'm like, what the hell is that? Why would you restrict an antiviral that's to be used early within symptoms, first days of symptoms? They're literally only using it in a phase of the disease where it's not going to work. And I was like, this is crazy. What are they doing? And that's what they had to resort to because they didn't want people using it's so diabolical, right? When you think of what they're trying to do, protect, and when you ask me what do I think is behind it, I generally talk pharma and financial interest, but we also know there's many layers to this, right? But I
Yeah.
kind of leave it at the feet of pharma, but because they've been doing this, and I want people to understand how they do it, and that's what the book is. I'm an educator at heart. That's what my career was. I won awards at major teaching centers, and I really do want to teach the world what I learned because we need to protect ourselves. They're gonna pull this stuff again and again.
Yeah. What is hydroxychloroquine? What's the purpose of that? So we know ivermectin is the antiparasitic for river blindness and whatnot, but what is
Oh,
hydroxychloroquine's function?
hydroxychloroquine is a sort of a mild immunosuppressant, so it's very good for like kind of autoimmune conditions and like chronic inflammatory conditions. But like a lot of medicines, they have multiple mechanisms of action, and hydroxychloroquine has an important mechanism which also interrupts the ability of the virus to replicate. So it has antiviral properties. And Fauci knew that. He's on record saying that. There's papers
Hmm.
from 2005 in SARS and MERS, and then suddenly they attack hydroxychloroquine. It's the same story over and over.
What is more effective, hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin against COVID?
The evidence shows ivermectin by far. Hydroxychloroquine was very good, but ivermectin was tremendously effective, especially in the first year. It was wicked. Delta, Delta did fine with if you treated early. Delta, I found that if I was getting to patients a little bit later, I had to pull out we use combination therapy. Most real doctors, like who know how to treat COVID, no one uses a single drug. That's the other
Hmm.
absurdity, right? They're all doing these trials with like single drugs. It's like, no, we all use combinations that have, numerous synergistic mechanisms. But I will tell you, my first experiences treating patients with COVID in 2020 was just astonishing. I mean, over and over and over again, patients would tell me within 12 to 24 hours that they were like, their fever had broke. They had a little bit more energy. Their chest lightened. They were coughing less. The efficacy of ivermectin was still there throughout, and it still is. It's not as sort of wow, like immediate response that I saw in the first year because the variants changed, viral loads changed, transmissibility changed, and so. But we still use it. It's still a mainstay of my treatment for COVID.
The new variants, if a lot of people are using ivermectin, do they build up a resistance to ivermectin?
No, it's not. I think because it's so highly effective. You got to worry much more about that with molnupiravir and Paxlovid. Molnupiravir literally induces mutations, so it's one of the craziest, dumbest ideas I've ever heard for an antiviral in a pandemic. Paxlovid just doesn't work very well, but no, there's no thought that ivermectin would cause resistance.
What is it? Why do you think that why is the industry, I think as a whole, we certainly saw this during the pandemic for sure, but maybe they were doing this in advance, but why are they so hell bent on vaccines? Like, I understand financially why the industry would want to downplay any sort of existing drug, especially if they can't make money on it, like ivermectin. They gave it away, there's no money there at all. So, I could understand them being really fiercely against that because of the monetary benefit. But why a vaccine? Like, why not? If they really want to make money, they could certainly make money off of pills too, like they're certainly doing with
Uh,
Paxlovid. So,
let me give
why vaccines?
So there could be a number of answers to that, but the simplest and the most easy to understand is the business proposal. If you look at the marketplace, so what do you make more money off of? Something that everybody is a customer for versus something that only those who are sick, right? And that's why vaccines have been this massive marketplace, and that's why the explosion in the childhood schedule, like we don't have to go off COVID, but I do want to talk a little bit about the explosion in the schedule, right? Because
Yeah.
after the vaccine companies got liability, right, removed in 1986, suddenly you saw all of these vaccine manufacturers. They were just thinking up things to vaccinate against. Because once you put a vaccine on the schedule, look at the market you have. You have healthy children that are now customers for your vaccines, right? And
Yeah.
so it's not those who are sick. And so it's really just the scope and the scale. And when you think of this pandemic coming out and you get the world to be convinced that the only solution is a vaccine, and you demonize and victimize those who don't want to take it, I mean, you're literally creating a marketplace of billions and billions and billions of vaccine doses. And that's what happened in COVID. They tried to vaccinate the entire world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting because now they've just found cases of malaria. Did you hear about this? They've just
Yes.
found some recent cases of malaria in Florida and in Texas. And it just so happens that only, last year they have a vaccine now for malaria. The first vaccine ever they finally just have come out with. And now they've administered some doses throughout Africa to children. And oh, gee. And then, of course, malaria shows up for the first time in 20 years on American soil. And hey, it just so happens there's a vaccine for this now that, by the way, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded the development of. And now this one, they can claim, they say, well, we've been testing this one for 10 years because they did their phase 3 clinical trials back in 2013. And then they finally got it approved and rolled out to the market in 2021. And they've given out like 4 or 5 million doses in Africa. And now, malaria shows up. And so that's going to be added to the vaccine schedule. So let's talk about that, this vaccine schedule that kids are having, because it has really increased from the time I was a kid to what is now today. I think kids take 10 or 20 times more vaccines. And it seems like they've changed the tune on vaccines as well. I'm not sure, but it said clearly on the CDC's website that you didn't need to be vaccinated if you had the disease. That's what the standard was for measles and chickenpox. But then with COVID, suddenly it was different. It was it doesn't matter if you've had COVID, you still need this vaccine suddenly.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if they're going to shift that narrative as well for like measles and chickenpox for kids. If they say, well, if you've had it, you still need it. We're still going to make you take it.
Yeah.
Why? But yeah, there's been this massive explosion. And is it just because they're really truly exploiting children? I mean, they're thinking, okay, we've got this big market and kids aren't going to be able to go to school, which puts parents in a terrible position. And, you can really leverage children that don't have a say for themselves, and you just scaremonger the parents into it. I mean, what do you think has been the cause of this?
I think it would be financial, but I mean, like I said, when you see the explosion in that schedule, right? Like when I was a kid, I was born in 1970. I think it might have been 8 or 10 different injections. Now to go
Yeah.
through the full schedule, you're up to 72. And where are the
Jeez.
epidemics of all these diseases that we're now vaccinating against, right? So they cannot stop vaccinating. And and when you say like leverage kids, one of the scariest things that I've learned in COVID is they will stop at nothing. They do not care. They do not care about our health. They have one single primary responsibility, which is to their shareholders. And they're really good at making money. It's one of the most profitable industries on earth. And their power is just unparalleled. I mean, they were the largest lobby on Capitol Hill in 2021. They gave 600. Their lobbying budget was so large it averaged out to $660,000 per member of Congress. And and with those schedules, yes, I mean they just keep giving, and we could go deep into what that's done to our health. I mean, it's decimated our health. And Bobby Kennedy talks about this a lot. There's so much data that we have an explosion of chronic conditions. And there are very good mechanistic reasons why you can relate it to vaccines being probably the biggest contributor to that explosion in chronic conditions. And so, and those chronic conditions didn't explode until the vaccine schedule exploded. And so they won't stop. I mean, like I said, this is a captive audience, and then they have all these other tools, right? These mandates, these childhood mandates, and I just went down and testified at the Wisconsin State Legislature. I live in Madison, Wisconsin right now, and the Department of Health was trying to put meningococcal vaccine. They were trying to mandate it for school children, as well as chickenpox. And the meningococcal vaccine, you have to understand, it went after a strain. There was, I think, on average in the last 5 years in Wisconsin, there's 6 cases of meningococcus, 6. And the strain to which this vaccine was covered only one of those cases. So they were proposing mandating this vaccine for like 200,000 or however large the school age population is in Wisconsin to prevent one case. Does that make any? You're literally injecting, antigens with adjuvants, which provoke immune responses, which is thought to be the cause of why we're getting some of these chronic conditions. And I went down there and I testified, and I basically we won that one. The committee in the legislature would not approve their ability to mandate that vaccine, but that's not the case everywhere. They can't stop mandating these things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that other countries don't mandate childhood vaccinations at all. Like in the UK, there's no mandate. They recommend vaccines and they'll
Yep.
strongly say to parents, we really think you should get these vaccines, but they're not mandated for the children to take. And here in the United States, I think we do. Are the kids mandated to take chickenpox vaccine? That was something as a kid. I just got chickenpox. I mean, that's how we did it. Chickenpox
I don't
parties.
know every state because I mean this is state level stuff, so I don't know how many. I'm sure there are states. I'm sure. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know for a fact, but I know in Wisconsin they just tried to do it, and we helped stop it.
Okay. What's interesting about the chickenpox vaccine is that I believe the UK doesn't even recommend it. I mean, they say some individuals maybe should take the chickenpox vaccine, but we don't ultimately recommend it because it leads to worse cases of shingles when they hit adulthood. But interestingly, there's a shingles vaccine, right? So you take the chickenpox vaccine and then don't worry about the shingles. You'll just take a shingles vaccine later. And we're kind of seeing that now with the COVID vaccine, right? They say, oh, here's the COVID vaccine. And then, oh, gee, now Moderna's working on a vaccine for heart inflammation. Like, are you, or something with the heart. It was like, are you kidding me? So you cause the problem and then you're going to solve it with another vaccine that you're going to have to take later. It's really bizarre.
No, and I wanted to make that point is that parallels what a lot of us think is going on with this explosion in the childhood schedule, which is it's so tightly correlated with this massive increase in chronic illness in a very cynical way. And you actually don't have to be that cynical. You could just say that's creating lifelong customers,
Yeah.
right? So your example of that, this vaccine then creating a market to prevent bad shingles when you're older. I mean, the explosions in asthma and ADHD and autism and allergies and I mean, EpiPens. I mean, it literally creates markets for massive amounts of pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
And the pharmaceutical industry, I think 2/3 of their profit comes from the US. I mean, I call us the United States of pharma. We have such bizarre legal constructs that does nothing but serve the pharmaceutical industry. Like, for instance, advertising, right? I think it's only us in New Zealand in the world that allows pharmaceutical companies to advertise their products,
Hmm.
right? And then we're the only country in the world in where they can charge whatever they want. And then you wonder why there's 2/3 of their profits coming. I mean, they charge these ridiculous, exorbitant sums that they can't get. I mean, I used to be an active pulmonologist. Now I specialize in a different area. But I remember some of my patients who were financially strapped, didn't have good insurance, and they were running out of their little albuterol to hold it, one of the oldest drugs in the world, right? Just a little bronchodilator. And you go to a pharmacy, I mean, it's $100, north of $100. You go to Greece, it's a dollar. It's a dollar, $2. I mean, it's the United States is just bizarre, and they are running roughshod over our society, and they absolutely decimated us in COVID.
But doctors know this. I mean, you know this as a physician that the pharmaceutical industry is a money-making machine. That's what they're there for. So
I
why are
disagree.
you
I
don't think doctors
disagree.
know this? Like why? Yeah, because that's my thing
No,
is like why wouldn't doctors be pushing back on this and trying to level it out and say, yeah, yeah, okay, we know your motivation, but
no.
let's now focus on the patient.
Here's why I disagree because I have to describe what I thought 3 years ago. And it was not as knowledgeable as what you're saying. So, like, my sense of the pharmaceutical industry's corruption, like, I could see their marketing. I could see, like, the salespeople that would come in, generally very attractive because most doctors were male. And, they
Right.
did all that, like, and the trips and the pens and the dinners. Like, and I thought that was, like, just some marketing corruption around the periphery. And, like, that part I know. They're trying to sell their products. But what I didn't know is the scope, the scale, and the depth of their corruption. I didn't know they had complete control over the high impact medical journals, over the agencies. Um, I didn't know that Fauci was literally working in the service of the pharmaceutical industry for 40 years, that he had turned the NIH into a pipeline for pharmaceutical companies. Like they literally use government money, do research, find molecules, and then get patents, sell the patents to the pharmaceutical companies, and then they get royalty. I mean, it's literally, that's why I say it is the United States of pharma, but I wasn't aware of that. And one of the points I want to make about the kid is like, they don't teach you this stuff in medical school. There is no class on like, beware, you're working in an industry that is like, do you think medical schools in this country could ever have that class in their curriculum? No, it's actually, here's another way of saying it is, I think you're obviously you're deeply knowledgeable. You study the world. You understand a lot of the things that happen in COVID. But what I see happened if most of the system doctors is they retained their implicit faith and trust in those institutions. Kim, when this pandemic started, I thought Anthony Fauci was a sympathetic guy in a tough spot with a lot of critics doing his best. That's literally what I thought. So I want to talk about the transformation, right? I
Yeah.
revered the high impact medical journals. I thought only the best science and the best scientists were published there. Now I know the whole game is run by pharma. Those journals publish what they are allowed to publish, nothing else. And the mirror image of what they saw them do to ivermectin, they did the mirror image to the vaccines.
Why
They
is it that the journals are captured? How are they being paid? Does the pharmaceutical company pay for them?
Yes, so they're massively profitable journals. They make a lot of their money from advertising in the journals as well as selling of reprints. So when a pharmaceutical study conducts a study, they'll order all of these reprints to hand out and disseminate, and they give lots of money. I mean, if you were to I'm just going to use the word piss off a pharmaceutical company as a journal, first of all, as an editor, you're not going to be around very long. And then you're going to decimate, they have ways of fighting back. And here's the one thing I want to add to that, Kim, is, this history of the control of the high impact medical journals, again, not taught to the average doctor. We're taught to revere those journals. Marcia Angel, she's a physician who was a 20-year chief editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. This is the number one highest impact journal in the world.
Mm-hmm.
She resigned in 2001 because she couldn't take it anymore. She saw that the medical journals were being completely controlled by pharma. So she resigned and wrote a book, what the drug companies don't tell you, or I can't remember the title of the book, but that's 20 years ago. She was, trying to call foul and trying to call attention to this. I didn't know that book. I'd never read that book. I can guarantee the average doctor in America has not read that book.
Yeah. I mean, definitely the pandemic really opened, I think, many of our eyes. I mean, obviously, a lot of people, their eyes are still wide shut, but a lot of us, like Johns Hopkins or, all of these revered institutions that would come out with, well, this is what our studies say. We didn't realize that, they're so heavily funded. They're reliant on these grants from like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or from other places that they are essentially catering to their donors or to their big money, their benefactors. And so they can't lose this money. They feel like, well, we need this money to continue our research. And so we have to, and I get it. I've had a lot of offers from wealthy individuals that say, hey, Kim, I'll help you support your show, build out a studio, do all of this. But then I always say no to it because I think, right. But then when you have an agenda on something that you think I should be talking about, and then I don't want to talk about it, but it's like your pet project, what you really care a lot about, you're going to ask me to do it. And because you funded my operation, we're business partners in this, I'm going to feel obligated to do that. That's just how the world works. That's just how it works. And they can say until they're blue in the face, no, we want you to be honest. We want you to continue, you don't, but it's like, yeah, but you don't want to piss off the money. So you can try to push back and say, I don't agree with you and I think you're wrong, but you risk upsetting them and the partnership dissolving, right? That's just natural. That's just the way the world works. So when these schools, universities, these research medical schools were taking grant money from these individuals that had their own agenda, and for whatever reason, Bill Gates he's got it really, like, he's really hot for vaccines. I think for me, I think my interpretation of it is that it's ideological. So he doesn't need money. It's for him more about he wants to be known as somebody who saved the world. And vaccines is the way to do it. He wants to be a god. He's at that level of money that money doesn't matter. Now it's just about your legacy. It is about having power and control, being a god. So I think maybe his ideological bent towards vaccines has to do with that. But that's really difficult. If you're funding disproportionate, you have a disproportionate amount of influence in the medical world, and you're pushing people towards vaccines, and everybody, you're just like, I just want vaccines. I just want vaccines. That's the only thing I want. They're going to then go along with that because they feel like, well, not only are they funding this project, but they're funding all these other projects, and these other projects are important. And maybe it's a pet project for the person who's in charge of the research facility, and they've got their pet project that's being funded. And so they just go along with these other narratives with other projects because, right? I mean, so
100%.
that was eye-opening, I think, for a lot of us to see like, wow, even the universities and the medical, the research is tainted. Not just who funded the study, but the facility itself is funded, and they can't say no to the people that have a certain ideology, and so, or a certain, agenda. So it's been really, really eye-opening. I'm just surprised that doctors, our first line of defense is people are our physicians, right? That's who we would think we could trust, is at least my doctor would actually look out for my health. That's what we're all under the impression of. And that we expect you as a doctor to fight against big pharma greed and not prescribe me medications I don't really need. But you're saying that's not the case.
No. So no, because of what, so here, I like what you just said, right? Your doctor's your first line of defense, right? You would think that they're interested in protecting your health and treating your illness. That is true. That's why we go to medical school. The problem is once you're inside that system, you're literally being, without really having the broader awareness, you're being taught that there's a pill for every problem. There's guidelines written. That you're told that these treatments work, and you're doing what you're taught is best for your patient's health, not what's best for their health. It's what you're taught. And what you're taught is this is the best approach. And I'll tell you, the average doctor has a lot of arrogance. And so they're not going to listen to the cheaper alternative therapies or the whispers of things that work or what's really good for your health. We don't do a good job with nutrition in modern medicine. We're really run by pharma, and I think that that idea, right, that doctors are deeply and broadly studied. They're deeply studied. It's just not broad. It's very curated and narrow. And by the way, I don't think I would have never spoken like this. Like, you used the term, it's been eye-opening to you. It's been transformative to me, what I've learned. And I see that system in I used to be inside that system. Now I'm on the outside and I'm looking at it and I see all of the faults. And you talk about the corruption of research funding. I mean, a friend of mine wrote an article on a Substack. He goes under, or they go under a pseudonym called A Midwestern Doctor. And he wrote this piece talking about how the funding by the NIH over the last 20 years, it generally funds very similar things, iterative improvements. There's been very little transformative discoveries in medicine. And when you compare it to historically, it's just kind of disappeared. And a lot of that is that funding structure that constantly is funding very narrow groups. There's nothing transformative, no real good repurposed drug research. Robert Malone got out of that industry. He was really working in repurposed drugs, and he found out that the doors are closed everywhere. You can't conduct big, good trials on medicines that don't make money. They don't want you to. And so, and then I would go further, Kim, is that feeling that, your doctor can be trusted and it's your first line of defense. The people I meet now after COVID, I lecture, I go to places, I have people coming up to me and they're scared of their doctor. And I'm not saying the doctor's a bad person. I'm saying that doctor is being lied to at a level no one understands. And he's actually using treatments that are lies, thinking that he or she is doing the right thing, but they're lies. And patients now are recoiling from their doctors because they see them as a representative of the pharmaceutical, pushing vaccines. I mean, people are getting boosted. They've had COVID 3 times. They're told to get boosted, or they've had a react. You know how many patients I have? Because I specialize in vaccine injury. So many of my patients, when they have to see a system doctor, they tell them that they're injured and how sick they are. And the doctor recommends a booster.
Wow. Yeah. There's also a lot of people with long COVID. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on long COVID? It's controversial whether or not people really have it, what the cause of it is, what the remedy of it is. Is ivermectin something that people use for it? I mean, what are your thoughts on long COVID?
I'll give you my rundown. So I went into practice a year and a half ago with a partner. We opened a telehealth clinic. I see patients all over the country and world. I see patients with two conditions. One is long COVID syndrome, and the other one is post-vaccine injury syndrome. They're
Hmm.
essentially the same. Only difference with long COVID is some patients have persistent pulmonary disease, where you don't see the pulmonary disease in the vaccines. But the core of the disease is they all have the syndromes that I see. Almost every patient I see comes with three main symptoms. One is fatigue like they've never experienced before, post exertional malaise, which is absolutely debilitating, meaning when they try to do some level of exertion or activity, their fatigue is just decimated. It's literally like a chronic fatigue syndrome or what's called myalgic encephalitis, which has long been known. It's a chronic condition. So they have fatigue, post exertional malaise, and some amount of what we call brain fog, which is a deficit in short term memory, processing, concentration, sometimes orientation. And then they have a whole side list of menus. But everyone comes with those three. On occasion, I'll see patients who don't have brain fog. But then the side menu is vast. I mean, I see so much neuropathy. So burning, tingling, pins and needles, numbness, all over their extremities and body, because that's from a massive small fiber neuropathy. I see motor problems. So fasciculations like contractions, that they can't control of their muscles. I see tremors. I see paralysis. I've seen ALS like syndromes. I mean, it can get very varied, but it does center around a core of this chronic fatigue and cognitive deficits. And I know there's some controversy to it. I've seen those papers. Me and my partner have hundreds of patients who are disabled with what I just described. They cannot go to work. They
Yeah.
can't go to work anymore. And so it's real. And it all started with one of those, like, how do I arrive at the diagnosis? Well, my definition of the syndrome is that it's a constellation of symptoms that develops in temporal association to one of those events. So for some, it's within days to weeks of recovering from COVID. With others, it's within sometimes minutes to hours, but days to weeks of the vaccine. And they can all time it to the triggering event, and they all present similarly. I mean, it's about as routine to me now because that's all I see. And I'm buried. And going back to your question about treatments, I work with a widening network, many of whom have been experts at treating chronic conditions. But we're finding new things that work all the time. Nothing's in the guidelines. There's no real research being done, at the system level. But ivermectin's a mainstay for me. I would say in my practice, I would say about 70% of my patients with these syndromes will respond to ivermectin. Now, sometimes the responses are quite modest, sometimes they're quite large. But it's kind of the first thing I give people. That and another drug which is called low dose naltrexone. Those two are kind of the most frequent positive responses. But I'm learning new interventions, compounds every day. My protocols are ever shifting because I'm learning with and from my patients and my colleagues. And we've made a lot of progress. I'm much more confident treating patients now than I was a year and a half ago.
What makes a person susceptible to vaccine injury or to long COVID when the rest of us are not having those types of symptoms?
Yeah, so I do think that there's a genetic component there because I am seeing in my vaccine injured, I'm seeing a preponderance of people with a disease called Ehlers-Danlos. It's like people who are hypermobile and flexible. It's a collagen kind of soft tissue disease. And there's something about them that seems to predispose them. That's one thing that I see. I think the biggest factor of who gets vaccine injured was the lot variation.
Mm.
That you can see that from the data. I think that single greatest predictor of you getting sick from a vaccine is what lot you got,
Yeah.
and even variation in the lots.
Well,
But
I
yeah,
just
I do.
covered a study that came out. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's a bombshell study that came out of Denmark where they actually looked at the lots and how many vaccine injuries came with each lot. And some batches had a really high rate of injury that was reported to their system, which was like 1 in 10 were. And so they quietly must have pulled those vaccines because they didn't give out. When they looked at how many doses were given out in those lots, it was really a lot fewer than the other lots,
Yep.
and so maybe they saw, oh, we got to pull that lot. But what was really crazy was that 1/3 of the vaccines, the so-called vaccines, the lot, yeah, it was a saline solution. I mean, clearly a placebo, and the regulators knew about it because they didn't even test those batches. It's like they knew we don't need to test those,
I,
which is a huge scandal if they were giving out saline solution, the pharmaceutical companies charging for it, or if they were clearly doing an experiment on the population, saying, "Well, let's we've got the placebo group, and then we've got the other group." So yeah, I guess what you're saying is it
Yeah.
really depends. Like, did you get a saline solution, or did you get a really potent version of the vaccine that's like these 1 in 10?
But Kim, the study that you cite, that's been known to us for a long time. What's unique about the study you cited, because I just looked at it this morning, is who it comes from. It comes from very prominent researchers at universities. So, I mean, we're living in a little bit different world now. I mean, that paper would have never seen the light of
Yeah,
day a couple of years ago.
right.
So the truth is, but we've known for a while. I mean, there's been deep experts who, for instance, there's a woman named Sasha Latipova. I don't know if you know of her work, but
Yeah,
she's an expert of what's called good manufacturing. And that's how she first got alerted that something was very, very wrong in COVID, because she saw variations in adverse events that were many, many, many multiples any other product or manufactured product that she saw, and she couldn't believe the silence. Like, you could
yeah.
see that these things were so poorly manufactured, or purposely, who knows? Um, but no one was doing anything about it. And like you just gave that example in Denmark, I mean, yeah, they might have pulled that one lot early, but I probably wasn't so early. It still got out to like 8,000. If it's 1 in
Oh,
10,
like 50,000. I mean, there was like 50 or
50,000. I
60 or
mean,
70,000 people.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But the
So
other lots had like hundreds of
zero.
thousands of
Right,
doses given out. So they probably
exactly.
pulled them. But so you think it's a variation in whatever you were given. Like somebody was just given way too potent of one, and somebody
Yes.
else got saline, and so they lucked out
I
with.
think many people, no, because here's the thing, right? So we know from VSafe data, as well as from CDC's VSafe data, which was only uncovered because of Del Bigtree's ICANN organization and Aaron Siri, the lawyer, who literally had to sue for access to data about the safety of these vaccines. And that showed that 7.8% of everyone in that database, and I think it was either a million or 10 million people, 7.8% reported needing to seek medical care as a
Yeah,
result of their vaccination. You have to think, right? I mean, you're going to get a vaccine and now you need to seek out medical care because something it did to you. And that also is borne out from VA data. So, but here's the thing, it was so toxic to so many, because 7.8, right, of 10 million is it's literally millions, right? And
yeah,
so the challenge is that they didn't do anything about it, right? So no, or the other thing is it's not 78%. So there's got to be a reason why, a lot of people didn't get affected, right? And I think I don't know, I really don't know how willful or purposeful this all was, but I do know they ignored massive reports of side effects. I mean, the stories, right? From back in the
yeah.
swine flu in 1976, that vaccine gets pulled. I think it was 50 deaths. We had hundreds of deaths within that first month, and nothing to see here, nothing to see here, right? And I mean, the vaccine story, uh, that has to be told in its entirety. And there's many layers that we're still uncovering. But I like that you brought up that paper, because that's now coming out into a little bit more mainstream press and more mainstream science, that there was something very, very wrong with the oversight and manufacture of those vaccines.
There's just no way they didn't know that those were placebos. All for that one, for those to have no checks by the regulators, they knew that they were placebos. I think the question is whether or not they did it because they were really experimenting on the population and saying, okay, we've got the control group, the placebo group, and then we've got this other group. Did they do it knowingly for test purposes? Did they do it knowingly because they saw the high rate of injury and they thought, oh, we got to mitigate this, so let's just give out a bunch of placebo to people so that they're not going to have the side effects, so we can lower that rate down.
Yeah.
But but it clearly looks like they did it on purpose. They gave out the placebo on purpose. So it wasn't just like a bad batch that was poorly manufactured and distributed, and maybe it lost its potency in the transit or something. It looks more purposeful. The question is, who are the criminals, right? Is it the government that was experimenting on people? Was it the vaccine manufacturers themselves knowing that their product sucked, but that everybody was expecting it, needing it, governments were pushing it, and so they were like, well, we have to come up with something. So here it is, bunch of saline.
Yeah.
That
That
there's a lot of questions there,
yeah,
and the
those
criminality of
questions,
it.
Kim, those questions, I defer to you. But no,
Well,
because you ask good questions, and the answers are, they're multiple, and they're really concerning, because I do think that there was, this is how I say it. I've been learning how they pull off this kind of corruption and fraud, what their ultimate objective, and who really started and is pulling the strings of all, who has all of that power. That part I don't really know. I know there's a list of suspects, but
right.
I just know how they do it. And really, to me, the core of COVID was the first time in history we've had immense consolidated global censorship and propaganda to
Yeah.
a heightened pitch. And I think the world went mad. And while the world was going mad, they got to hide a lot of stuff that they were doing. People dancing around, telling everyone to get vaccinated. They're hiding the danger signals. And I'm sorry, but I really do believe it was the media that it was like the proximate cause of so much catastrophe. We couldn't
Oh,
get
yeah.
accurate information out. I mean, look at my life. I've been
Right.
screaming from the sidelines on ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine treatment, vaccines, and you couldn't get good information out.
Yeah. I want to wrap up here, and this has been a really wonderful conversation, but I want to finish up with some ivermectin recommendations. I mean, you say it still works for the current variants that are out there. One thing that, what you've mentioned in your FLCCC protocols is to take it as a prophylactic, right? So that you don't end up getting COVID. And I did that myself at one point. My dad came down with COVID, with Delta variant, it looked like. I went to go take care of him. I gave him the FLCCC protocol. And then I did it myself too. I thought, well, I might as well also try the preventative and see what happens, because I'm going to be
Yeah,
locked in a house with this COVID person. And I didn't get COVID. I mean, I did the protocol. I was in his face. He was coughing in my face. He was sick as a dog. And I was there, really taking care of him. And I did not catch COVID at all. I later on, my husband got COVID, and it was right before we were to get married, actually, like a month before our wedding. And I thought, okay, my dad was like, take the ivermectin again, do it
yeah.
again, and I was like, no, this time I'm getting COVID, because what I don't want is, I don't want to end up getting it right before the wedding or right before the honeymoon. Like, I just want to get it over with. I don't want to risk it. I'm just going to do it, get it over with. So I made,
That's funny.
everybody around was like, did you do the ivermectin again? I was like, no, this time I'm trying to catch COVID. And I caught it. And then I did the
And then you
protocol once
treated
I
it.
had
Okay.
it. Yeah, then
All
I
right.
treated it, and it was very mild. I
Yeah.
mean, reasonably mild for me. But what is it? So if somebody's going to try to not get COVID, do they need to take ivermectin every day? I mean, for years?
Yeah. So I have different recommendations on that now. So in the beginning, like in that first year, I was taking it weekly. Now, with the variants changed, then we started to realize that you needed to take it a little bit more frequently. But I think that the landscape is so different, right? So it's Omicron now. It's milder. We have so much natural immunity. Like, I don't think it's that important for most people. I think a lot of us who learn to keep our vitamin D levels up, and
Yeah.
like, I don't take it anymore. I don't care. I've had COVID twice. The second time was like a sniffle. And but with my patients, my guidance to my patients, there's physician preference and patient preference. I have some patients who unfortunately are still terrified of COVID. And although I try to explain to them that it's not so scary anymore and it can be easily and early treated, some of them prefer to stay on it. Others have medical conditions where, especially my vaccine injured and long haulers, quite a few of them, I'd say 50% or more, when they get another case of COVID, their long COVID symptoms get worse. Not all of them,
Yeah.
but enough of them. So for them, it's good to be on a preventative, if I'm not treating them with it. And then just some comorbidities like immunosuppressed folks and stuff. But it's just not that deadly of a disease anymore. For most people, it never was for most people, but even for people who have comorbidities, it's much, much, much less. And so it's really patient preference. I don't really recommend it to most. What I did then, there's also hybrid approaches, which is some patients, just because we do so much remote or at home, I say you don't have to take it every week or twice a week. You can just take it around times of lots of exposure, right? You go into a wedding,
Hmm.
you go in traveling, you don't want to get sick while you're traveling. I'm like, start 2 days before and just take it every day while you're traveling. And some do that. And I get plenty of anecdotes where they went on a trip with a whole bunch of friends and a bunch of them got sick and they came home and they didn't, and so
Right.
there's different ways of doing it, but yeah, I'm not a hard and fast like everybody should be on it anymore.
So it's more of when you catch COVID, then you want to start the protocol.
Yes, early treatment is still standard for me. I think everyone should treat early with combination of treatments. I basically at this point I use ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine with a couple other different supplements as my standard protocol. In some of the early events, like late phase Delta, which was like October November of 2021, right before
Yeah.
Omicron, that was wicked. Ivermectin
Yeah.
wasn't doing it. It was unless you treated really early. But I was using so many medicines. I mean, I had some people on 6 or 7 medicines to keep them out of the hospital, and I kept them out. That's all I can say is I kept them out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely. I mean, I never understood the demonizing. I always just thought, why wouldn't you try everything? And certainly, why wouldn't you try something that's totally safe? I mean, okay, let's say it doesn't work at all. Well, at least then you don't have parasites. I mean, you're
Yeah,
parasite free. So,
and it's
like,
safer than Tylenol. That's the thing. I mean, that question you just posed, that was like what we were screaming from day one. Like, do you see how safe this is? All of the early evidence is screaming that it's highly effective on a risk
yeah,
benefit, which is what we do in everything you do in medicine is an assessment of risks, benefits, and alternatives. And that's how you arrive at treatment decisions. And so if you say that the potential upside is so high, the downside is so low, and there's no alternative, any pragmatic physician would say, and we should do this. By the way, I want to tell you an anecdote from something that you said earlier. You said that you acted upon that early Australia study. And I
yeah,
don't know if you know this, and I talk about it a little in the book. The entire country of Peru, based on that single in vitro study, put it in their national protocol. Now, it wasn't in there long because that's going to get attacked, and all the big city academics and all that. How could we put something in the protocol based on an in vitro study and all this stuff? But it was there for a while, and
hmm
I just want to say, like, you acted like the country of Peru initially acted, which is
yeah.
totally reasonable. It's a totally reasonable thing that you did. So safe. So anyway, I
Yeah, I
wish
mean, it was,
everybody had done that.
it's an easy drug to take. It's not a big deal. And like I said, at the end, at least you don't have parasites. Some of the criticism that there's been with ivermectin is, well, it's only, maybe it reduces your chance of by 10%, or whatever, a real minimal amount. And I'm like, 10% is better than no percent, right? Zero is, I mean, if you are at risk of hospitalization and because you're in that certain age group, if somebody said, look, you could take this, it's only going to maybe work 10% chance that it reduces. That's better than nothing. And like I said, at the end, you just end up dewormed. Okay, fine. Like
Kim,
in the minimum. But they just really went after this hard and wouldn't even
it's
give it a
not.
fair shot.
Yeah, it's not 10%. The reductions in hospitalizations and deaths are north of 75 to 80%. I mean, even
Wow.
in the WHO document, this is the most. I'll give you one last clown example of what happened in this war. Is the WHO tasked with forming a guideline around ivermectin? There's a researcher that I worked with for a time until he got captured, but he amassed all of these randomized control trials. So the WHO committee gets all these randomized control trials. They throw out as many as they can for really made up reasons because it wasn't in their protocol. And they're left with a handful that they decided to keep. In that handful, it's in their document. It showed that there was an 81% reduction in death in ivermectin treated patients. 81%. And do you know why they didn't recommend ivermectin? Because they determined that the evidence was of too low certainty. And so their argument was this. This is how they would get around a Kim Iverson. So this is the language they use. I'm not making this up. They said that based on pre-assessed principles and understandings of behavior, we think that the average person would not want to take a drug outside of a clinical trial on such an uncertain evidence base. So literally, it's the WHO telling the world that the average person in the world would not want to take their chances with one of the safest drugs in history, with the prospect of dying when it's offering an 81% reduction in death. And that's how they didn't recommend it. They literally had to use that statement to not arrive at a recommendation for it. Because how do you
Yeah.
put out a document with 81% reduction in death and say, we don't think you should use it? That's the
Yeah.
absurd reasoning.
So they basically just said, we just don't think you're going to like this. So we're not going to even
Yes.
show it to you. That's why.
So
You're
I
not going to
do this.
like it. You don't need to see it. You don't need to
So
see it.
I say this. I'm picturing a patient in bed, short of breath, right? And the doctor comes in and says, I have this pill. Um, the early data or the data the WHO has shows that it's going to reduce your chance of dying by 81%. And the patient
Right.
says, well, how certain is that evidence base? And the physician says, well, the WHO says it's uncertain. I will not take a drug with an uncertain evidence base until the WHO says. I mean, that's
Yeah, it just
literally what
makes
they're
no sense.
defending.
Instead, I'd
Yeah.
rather lay here in bed with an uncertain future. Right.
Yeah.
Like that's everything's uncertain. Last, I want to ask you is with this war on ivermectin, where are we at with the studies then? Is there a study happening now that, are we going to finally get this study that is, that meets the standards that the FDA and the WHO and the CDC that they want? Where are we at with these studies?
They've already met those standards. That's why it's the big six. The war's over, Kim, in my opinion. The war's over. There's no more big studies planned. And you know why they're not planned? There's no more planned. They, with those big six trials, just six of them out of the 97, they have come to the conclusion. All of the societies in this country, the agencies have come to the conclusion that ivermectin is ineffective. So why do you have to do more studies? They've already proven it doesn't work. So that's why I said we fought this to a stalemate. Our protocols got out to a good portion of the world. We did the best we could. We were the bad news bears up against the Yankees, and you know, it is what it is. But there's going to be more wars to fight, and I'll tell you, me and my organization, the FLCCC, we're starting to poke the bear in other areas. My colleague, Professor Paul Marik, just published a scientific monograph of the top 20 repurposed therapies for cancer. And by the way, you go into cancer, that's poking a big
That
bear right
is,
now.
yeah.
So we're not going to stop. We're going to keep going.
I hope you do tackle that cancer one. I remember I was in a long relationship with somebody who had gone through medical school and graduated. And I remember at his medical school graduation, the main speaker was one of the top cancer researchers in the world. And this was like 20 years ago or something. And he says, we are on the brink of a cure for cancer. Like we will have a cure within this decade. But we still don't see that cure. And I think it is, look, there's a lot of money in treating cancer, and there's really no money in curing it. And
No
and so we see this, researchers are totally limited.
Paul, with this document, so it's on our website, flccc.net. It's under medical evidence. It's a phenomenal piece of work. I mean, he read 800, 1,000 papers on all sorts of therapies, but you would be shocked about how much evidence there is for certain treatments for cancer, how overwhelmingly positive they are. But oncologists don't use them. They're not taught to use them. They're not in guidelines. And the fraud and corruption has been around for a long time. I just thought ivermectin was going to be a good case study to write a book on because I had a front row seat to everything. I watched everything. Once I learned the disinformation tactics, that day that I learned it, I knew what they were doing, and I documented everything. And I think I told a pretty compelling tale. People seem to really like the book, and I think it's an important book to read.
I think so also, because even if you said we're at a stalemate, there's nothing, the battle is over, like this is it with this particular drug, learning the tactics, seeing how they behaved, really understanding it, I think is important for the future battles that we're inevitably going to have. So, Dr. Pierre Kory, thank you so much for joining us tonight and giving us your insight. And thanks for writing the books that we can learn these methods and figure out, how to navigate our futures with the pharmaceutical industry and the medical community the way that it is, unfortunately for us. So, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Take care.